Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day, busy schedule, to have this interview with me. And first of all, I just want to ask you a couple questions. Well, more not a couple questions, but some questions. You're from the Tennessean, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a business writer with the Tennessean. I write about healthcare business and commercial real estate.
Okay. And exactly why the business aspect of it?
Well, I grew up with a lot of interest in business. My mother was an economist in Liberia, and so, I grew up with these textbooks around monetary policy, interest rates, and stuff like that. So I think that initially drew me into business, and later on in life, became a writer because I had a passion for writing. But I still had this curiosity to learn more about business. So at some point, I had to reach the conclusion that I could merge these two interests together. I studied economics and finance, and I did an MBA. And somewhere in the middle of the MBA, I realized I have this business education, but I have a passion for writing. So why not combine the two together? And that's how I went into writing about business. I started when I interned with a commercial at PU in '95 in Memphis, and they put me on their business desk, and that's when the light clicked and said, well, this may be what you probably would be a good niche in writing for you,
Okay. Yeah. Being from Liberia, you're from Liberia, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you ever see yourself as becoming a journalist, let alone a journalist in America?
Well, as far as in America, I really didn't aspire to come here initially because, I finished high school in Liberia. I actually was a sophomore at the University of Liberia in '90. And then, unfortunately, we had a civil war in Liberia, and that's when the war hit the capital city. So when it hit the capital city, I was out of school for almost a year and a half, and because there was not anything going on, fighting and the government, the rebels. And so my parents decided they were going to send me to the U.S. for school. Maybe I would have come here later on for grad school, but it was not on my mind about coming to America. But as far as being a journalist, I think at an early age I developed an interest in writing and news, but it took a while for me to realize that was my true calling. I started off writing poetry. I remember my first poem was called The Beaches of Liberia. And I think just going to the beach, we had a lot of coast, the Atlantic, and it just moved me. And I wrote a poem about the seashells and everything else. You find the beauty of the beaches in Liberia. And then later on, I started creating my own puzzles, and I even tried to write a short story. It was called The Country's Girl, City Life. It was actually like a novel, where I was kind of talking about this girl who came from the countryside, experiencing the city for the first time. And I was probably just about 11, 12, 13 around that time. So it was kind of, that passion started to develop. And then my parents would bring the newspaper home every day. And as I read it, I was just fascinated with the fact that I could learn so much, but not only what's happening in Liberia, but around the world. And so, and my father too, we had one newscast that came on at 8 o'clock every night. And once in a while, when he had to be out of the house where he couldn't be home in time to watch the news, he would tell me to watch it for him and relay to him what were the highlights. So I guess that was my early beginning in reporting. But for a while there, I was struggling with whether that's my primary career because in Liberia, journalism get paid a lot at the time. And then in African culture, sometimes the government is not very tolerant of critical reporting, So there's also the aspect of being careful going into journalism because I remember once I interned with a newspaper called The Standard, and I was only 15 at the time, and one of the stories I did was about some government official, and he was implicated in trying to hide the true findings of an audit report. And I remember I wrote this story. Nobody wanted to publish that story in the city. Everybody, for some reason, was afraid. And it's government official, and I wrote it, and I remember somebody telling me, you better be careful. I was just 15, 16, and it was a military government. He said, you better be careful because, people could try to target you if you continue, reporting stuff that may be damaging to them per se. So, but it was not so much that, but just a combination of things, and my interest in business led me to decide to study business instead. And so that's why, even though I knew I would always be writing, I would I decided that I wanted to study business, and I even at one point started a newspaper in my country. It was a student newspaper. We just one time we published called the Liberian Student Tribune, because I was passionate about writing. So I won an essay contest where I came in second, and the prize was like $1,000. And back then, you know, that was big money. You know, mid 80s to late 80s, and I used that to start a newspaper. So you know, and that's partly had my career began in journalism, but it took some time for me to eventually, after I came to America and saw more freedom in the press and everything, I said, you know, even though I was thinking about just writing on the side, but really this, looking at it, this probably my true calling in terms of me doing, and it just worked well that I had the business background to fit it together, because as a writer, I think you need an area of emphasis. You know, you can be a writer in general, but you have to pick an area you're passionate about to write about. Then it makes it a little easier. You don't feel like it's work. You feel like you're excited when you talk to some CEOs, learning about business and how people start something from small as a company and it becomes something so big with thousands of employees, you know. Stories like that fascinate me, you know, so, yeah.
Okay. In your story, you spoke about, you know, having hard times as far as having to be careful as a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever had that pressure writing for the Tennessean?
Yeah. Well, in a way, because I think companies too can be a little controlling, you know, covering business news. Because I know, for example, one thing you first have to do as a journalist, you want to be accurate, right? Because that's your credibility right there. Whatever you put in print becomes the first draft of history, you know, so that's why as a journalist you have to really take serious attention. I see sometimes students may be very sloppy in how they write and stuff. No, you got to check the facts, get the facts. But I think at times companies, maybe lack of understanding of the media, they have their own perception on what stories should be. You know, nobody like negative publicity. So I had a situation where companies maybe, there was one CEO, for example, I did an interview with him. His company, at the time, they have a publicly traded stock, and there was some, people were concerned whether the industry they're in, what they do, helping to reduce healthcare costs and make the patient better. They were into what they call disease management, and that's basically having nurses on the phone that called on people who were having chronic diseases and try to coach them on, are you taking your medicine and those kind of things. And at the time there were a lot of questions on Wall Street, is this really saving money? You know, they had a Medicare pilot program they were doing with Medicare to see whether that model of care saved money. And I did an interview with the CEO, and I wrote a story, ran on a Sunday in the Tennessean, and I think when I interviewed him, his perception was that it was going to be a happy-go-marriage story. You know, everything would be how great the company is. But at the time, there were some analysts on Wall Street were questioning, it's not 100% certain that this company approach actually works or save money, because that's what everybody's looking for in healthcare, save money, improve care of the patient. And so I wrote this story with that in mind, saying both that, yeah, I mentioned some positives about the company, but I also mentioned the critical stuff. And this CEO got so furious that he, after the story ran, that up to today, he won't give me an interview, you know, or talk to him. He kind of felt, I don't know, maybe he felt like because he gave me an interview, it was going to be, or, but you see, as a journalist, we have a serious responsibility to the public. So if you can be worried too much about pleasing everybody, because if you do, like for example, that company, after I wrote that story, 2 weeks after I did, their stock fell like 30–40%. And it was because of some of those same reasons I was raising in the story. There were people who were concerned about what else. So I feel like I do my job, not so much to get people not to buy their stock, but the idea is that what if I done a hunky-dory story, all this good story, but then somebody was investing their money in that company based on my story? Well, it's my job as a journalist to go in with a critical but fair eye and, you know, tell his story. So, I mean, I've run into situations. Yeah.
Okay. Did anyone inspire you to become a writer?
Yeah, I think growing up, I don't know, maybe I was a nerd or something. I just migrated to all the encyclopedias on the bookshelf in the house, dictionary. I was always reading the encyclopedia from A to Z, and some of my mother textbooks. I couldn't understand everything in there because she had gone to college in America and went back home. She went to school in San Francisco and Idaho, did a master's in economic development, and went back to work for her country. And so I got to reading early, but I think it was, even though I started writing on my own, there were some people along the way, I think, that were inspirations. For example, my high school English teacher, he was teaching English literature, Mr. Jacob Golaku. He was from Ghana but working in Liberia. And we formed a very strong bond. And I think early on he spotted something special in me from writing. And I remember he taught English literature like Julius Caesar. We did Julius Caesar. We did some African novels. And I just admired the passion he had for the English language, the written word. And when he's teaching, and remember, even after I finished high school, I came back to the school to help. Sometimes he would let me teach his class. And we would teach Shakespeare, like lines like cowards die many times before their death, but the villain never tastes of death but once. Of all the wonders yet I've known, it seems so strange that man should fear, seeing that death a necessary end will come when it will come. You know, just power of language, I can inspire me. So again, Mr. Jacob was an inspiration because he took me under his wings, and even he was an advisor when I started at student newspaper. And then when I came to the U.S., even though I was studying business, because I went into study economics and finance, I remember one of my teachers in the College of Business at TSU, Dr. Robert Vowers, he spotted early my writing proficiency too. I remember one of the first papers we had to do in the class, when he brought it back and turned it back to the class, he wrote on my mark of a scholar. You know, so that was an inspiration too, you know. And so, yeah, people like that, my teachers in college and high school. And then when I was growing up too, even though I didn't look at him that way, but there was a fellow in Liberia, he died in like 1988, called Baiti Moore. He's one of the most famous Liberian writers. And when I was younger, my parents didn't have a car, so his wife worked at the school I went to, so we used to get a ride home with them. But Baiti Moore wrote books, one called Murder in the Cassava Patch, almost like a crime drama in an African setting. And he wrote a collection of poetry called Ebony Dust, and I learned a lot of those poems. So I think, in a way, even though he was a very quiet older man, I never got to talk to him a lot, but I think it was inspiring to know somebody who was a writer and making his mark on the word or through his writing, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. When you were in Liberia, what were your goals as a young writer?
Yeah, as a young writer, I was very ambitious. I think, like I said, at one point I tried to write a novel, and I have the first chapter, but I didn't have a typewriter at the time, so a friend of mine was typing it, and for some reason he said he spilled something on it, and I never got the rest of it. But I also wrote a lot of poetry and stuff. But I think as a writer, I always was trying to find ways, how do I get better at what I do, you know? And as a writer, I think reading was a big part of that, because I think the more you read other people writing, the more you see style, the more you learn, you know, about writing. And that's why I try to tell people, I say, man, the best way to become a writer is to do it, you know, because I think students sometimes get caught up in the degrees and stuff. But honestly, I don't have a bachelor's or master's in journalism. Everything I've learned, I basically just wrote, you know, doing it. And I got corrected sometimes, and I took this correction in mind. And but I did take I took classes like news writing, feature writing, you know, but never like a full degree. But again, writing is something practical. You just have to do it. And you may make mistakes here, but then learn from your mistake. Again, read other people writing, and I think that's what I wanted to be, a better writer. So that was mainly my focus as a young writer growing up.
Okay.